Today, we have a very famous international guest. It's Dr. Jordan Peterson, one of the greatest thinkers of our time. And we have the honor to have him here. He is in Holland. He is in Amsterdam. And in a few moments, we'll start a Skype interview. Usually my guests are in the studio, but Dr. Peterson is so occupied with all his touring and endeavors that he agreed to do a Skype interview. So welcome to the show. Welcome in Vechten met Moszkowicz, or Fighting with Moszkowicz. So how is Amsterdam treating you, Dr. Peterson?
Well, I love Amsterdam, and so every time I'm here, I'm happy to be here. And I've spoken to a number of journalists yesterday, and that's mostly what I've been doing, speaking to journalists and to my publisher. And but that's all fine. That's what I'm here for. It's a business trip. I'm looking forward to my talk tonight. And I've got more journalists to talk to tomorrow. So
yeah, so there's a lot of commotion in Holland on the left side because you're here. Have you noticed any of that?
Well, I noticed that there was 80 people at the University of Amsterdam who wrote a letter complaining about the fact that I was invited to speak there.
Well, I think it's without any doubt that you helped a lot of people and that you have a lot of fans. But if we look, for example, to the reaction in your blog, you really choose to attack, especially on certain moments in the blog. Like why do you do that?
Gloves are off when it comes to professors.
Okay.
They're part of my crowd, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And when I see them write a letter that's that incoherent and then sign it so carelessly, then it's perfectly reasonable to put up a, let's call it, vigorous defense. I mean, one of the most comical things about that letter, I thought, was the attempt by the authors of the letter, and by implication the signatories, to go after me for the insufficiency of my scientific objectivity. I mean, first, I thought that was just absolutely beyond the pale, given that the people who occupy the ideological position that would compel them to write that letter are critics of the very idea of scientific objectivity itself. And so it's quite convenient for them to be critics of the idea that that even exists, and then also to claim that, well, despite the fact that it doesn't exist, they happen to be much better at it than me.
Yeah.
So it's like, really?
I wasn't particularly aware of the invitation until about a week ago, because I'm swamped enough in my schedule so that I really pay attention to what I'm going to do the next day, that day. But I did note their concerns and wrote a blog post in response. That's at jordanbpeterson.com if people are interested. So, you know, I have a certain amount of trepidation about going to speak at universities, because it can be fine, but it can often be an exceedingly unpleasant experience.
There's a tendency in America and in Holland, we've all noticed that regressive left wing have touched ground there. They are firmly worked into the universities. What do you think about that?
Well, I would say the majority of university students, and even the majority of people who work at universities, are generally quite sensible people, particularly if you speak to them one-on-one. But there's a minority that's quite overrepresented on university campuses that holds radical left views, collectivist views, I would say. And they're very well organized, partly as a consequence of many decades of subsidy from the public purse and from tuition fees, etc. And so they pull a disproportionate amount of weight and tend to cause a lot of trouble in all sorts of ways. So, but,
yes,
you know, like at a place like the University of Toronto, the vast majority of students are sensible and working on getting their degree, and most of the faculty members are busily concentrating on their research, especially in the STEM fields. The humanities and the social sciences are something else. I mean, I think they've been corrupted to some degree beyond redemption, and it isn't clear to me what the consequence of that's going to be. And they're certainly on the attack with regards to the STEM fields in places like the United States, and that will spread everywhere in relatively short order and isn't going to be good for anyone.
What happened? Why is there such a growth in identity politics and the white privilege movement or white
the idea of white privilege, for example. But identity politics is a good way to conceptualize it. Well, I think it's part of a doctrine that has been developing since, well, really for the entire last century, because it's mostly a radical left doctrine that has its roots in Marxism. It more or less went underground in some sense in the late 60s, after it became painfully obvious even to French intellectuals that what had happened in the Soviet Union and Maoist China was an utter catastrophe, and that a substantive proportion of that could be attributed directly to the policies rather than to the personalities. And the evidence of that was that the same catastrophe kept repeating itself in country after country, despite different leadership and different cultural backgrounds and all of that. And so the Marxists basically performed a sleight of hand and transformed the proletariat bourgeoisie narrative into the victim-oppressor narrative along pick your dimension of group identity. And so that's been developing away over the last 30 years and gaining a fair bit of power as it's become more and more dominant in more and more university disciplines. Part of that's because serious scholars just haven't paid any attention to it and haven't criticized it out of existence, which should have happened probably should have happened in the early 90s, if not earlier than that.
Why is the aggression so much directed to white people? It feels a bit racist to me.
Well, it's quite comical. I mean, it's part and parcel of playing an identity politics game. I mean, as soon as you accept the proposition that the best way to categorize people is as a consequence of their group identity, and you believe that the victim-oppressor narrative is the proper way to characterize history, the present and the future, then the logical target is that identity group which your ideology demands that you believe is on top for reasons of oppression. It's a natural consequence of belief in something like the oppressive tyrannical patriarchy. You know, and that's really the central axiom in some sense, and everything revolves around that. So it's a logical consequence of the axioms of the ideology. Now, one of the things that's extraordinarily comical about this, and this was just revealed by a political science report that was reviewed by the Atlantic Monthly last week, is that first of all, people who hold these views, these identity politics views, seem to be something approximating 8%, say, of the US population, and it's probably somewhat representative across the Western world, but that the people who are holding the views are disproportionately white, disproportionately well-educated, and disproportionately wealthy, whereas the vast majority of the minorities who these activists are purporting to serve are firmly opposed to the identity politics game in any of its forms. So what's very comical is that not only is this a racist preoccupation because it defines people according to race, not necessarily because it's directed against white people, I mean, that's one aspect of it, but because it defines people according to race, but that it's actually a variant of neo-colonial paternalism, to use the language of the people who are putting forward the ideology.
Exactly.
It's so ridiculous that you could hardly make it up.
And there's also something completely contradictory because you also have the gender issue, and that is people are supposed to identify as they feel. Say, I'm a man, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, or I feel like a bunny rabbit, I identify as a bunny rabbit. But you're still biologically a man, right? So I can't call you a man, but they will force upon you to call you a white, angry man.
Well, it's part of the internal contradictions that are part and parcel of the identity politics game. I think one of the most comical elements of the gender debate is the insistence that, for example, a man can be born in a woman's body or vice versa, which is clearly a biological argument, conjoined with the insistence that gender is nothing but a social construct and that it's a matter of, and also that it's a matter of choice. All three of those things are contradictory. So if it's not biology that determines gender identity, then you can't be a man born in a woman's body. If gender is socially constructed and not biologically constructed, then it can't merely be a matter of choice. So you can't have all three of those things at the same time. I tried to point out to the Canadian Senate that the idea that gender is nothing but a social construct which is part and parcel, generally speaking, of the radical leftists' ideology, is actually the same argument that religious fundamentalists who have been attempting to denounce homosexuality for the last 100 years have been making. Say, well, it's not biological, it's just a matter of, well, learning or choice. It's like, well, so are you making an argument that's going to serve you well, or are you going to making an argument that's going to do you harm? It's by no means obvious. But, you know, it's not like subtlety of argumentation is a particular characteristic of radical leftist collectivist ideologues who have a few simple axioms that they use to frame the entire world and who are fundamentally opaque to any counter arguments or really to reason itself, which they don't believe in any case. So,
Dr. Peterson, to me you're a beacon in darkness when we talk about this. It's so hard to address these issues here without being insulted, without getting aggression online.
Well, one of the horrible things is that I don't believe there's any evidence whatsoever that these doctrines are going to positively serve the communities that they purport to serve. And you know, I took a stance against this Bill C-16 in Canada, and I suppose most of the listeners know about that. And hypothetically, that made me an enemy of the transgender community. But the funny thing is that I've received far more letters from transgender people in support of what I'm doing than criticizing it. And also, who in the world decided that a handful of transgender activists speak for the transgender community? I mean, first of all, it's not a homogenous community. Second, it's not a community. Third, it hasn't elected its representatives. And fourth, just because you're the self-proclaimed member of a self-identified minority, that doesn't make you a credible spokesman with political power for those people. One of the things that we really have to learn is that we have to stop being guilty when confronted by a so-called minority activist who claims to speak on behalf of their entire people, as if they're a homogenous group. So that's not helpful in the least.
How do you explain these group dynamics of people trying to identify as a group with a common enemy, and it's almost cult-like?
Well, look, the way it works, as far as I'm concerned, is that, and I think this is what Solzhenitsyn outlined so well in his Gulag Archipelago when he was trying to account for the murderousness of the Soviet system. You have an idea, a set of ideas, and the ideas have some presuppositions, and those presuppositions, out of those presuppositions, certain logical conclusions necessarily flow. Okay, so once you buy the presuppositions, and the identity politics presuppositions are first, as I pointed out, that the Western culture, especially capitalist culture, but perhaps even democratic culture, is a tyrannical patriarchy. And second, that you should classify people according to their group identity. And third, that history is a victim-victimizer narrative, most appropriately. And finally, perhaps, that social identity is socially constructed. Once you accept those four things, then the entire ideology tends to operate as a deterministic machine. Now, if you're talking to a single person who believes some of those things now and then in the same sort of casual way that people believe most political presuppositions, it's really not that much of a problem, because you're probably talking to a person who's like 95% like everyone else and normal and reasonable and easy to get along with, and 5% committed to their political ideology. But if you get 100 people like that in a mob, then the ideology is complete and it dominates. Right. And so then that drives people to all sorts of misbehavior. And so that's part of the problem with mobs, is that they get possessed by their shared belief system, and then everyone acts in a reprehensible manner. And that's what we see happening time and time again. It's certainly part of what's happening in the universities.
I want to share an anecdote with you. I got into a discussion online. I shouldn't do that, I know. But some people, they said, you are an angry white male. We've talked about this just before. But I started saying, I'm not white. And it was totally confusing for the people who were arguing with me. And eventually they were making me admit color. So, no, you are white. You have to admit you're white. You have to admit you are of this patriarchy that is suppressing people, etc., etc. And then I said, I'm still not white. You can't call me white. And they were so confused. And eventually I said, I'm Semitic with a migrant background. So I took away them trying to frame me in some, they just wanted to exactly know that they wanted to put me in a certain place. And when I was refusing to do that, they couldn't place me anymore. They were totally confused.
Sure. Well, the thing is that the arguments that are leveled against a person by someone who's primarily playing an ideological game only work if the category structure works.
Right.
So you stepped out of the category structure. But, if they would have been sophisticated, they would have said, well, it doesn't really matter that you're not white. You're male, and that's bad enough. Or you're angry and male. Well, I mean, that's how I would have played it had I been on the other side.
Right.
Because you were basically put into three categories, right? Inappropriately angry, inappropriate because you're privileged, and so you don't get to be angry, and anger isn't appropriate anyway. So that's category error number one. White, that's category error number two, and male. And so I would have just said, well, I don't care if you're white. You're white enough for my purposes, but you're also angry and male, and that's enough to make you reprehensible. And one of the things that's so interesting is that, and I really thought about this a lot more deeply, I wrote the foreword to Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the 50th anniversary version, and that's going to be released in a couple of days. And one of the things I realized, and I suppose this is a commentary on intersectionality, although perhaps a critical commentary, is that most people can be parsed into or placed into multiple groups, right? Because each of us has a complex sequence of potential group identities. Like you're, you have some racial category, some ethnic category, some sexual category, some degree of attractiveness, some degree of intelligence, some kind of class background, some degree of age, and so forth. And so there's multiple categories that can be applied to you.
Yeah, it's like the tree metaphor, right? You have all these roots, and all of those roots hold the tree together.
Yes. But the thing that's so interesting about that is that what's so terrible about that is that if I'm particularly obsessed, let's say, with the victimizer narrative, and I want to spread that as widely as possible, and I'm talking to you, all I have to do is figure out on which of your group identity dimensions you constitute a victimizer, and then I can make you into the target. And this is what happened in the Soviet Union, is that because people could be categorized in so many identities, it became a race to determine with each person what dimension along which they were a victimizer, and that was always sufficient to have them trotted off to the camps or worse.
Well, I have a background like that. My grandfather was the only survivor of the Holocaust in our family. And it still fascinates me what happened. Why were they perceived as people, the Jewish people, who were victimizing other people and were punished so badly that they had to be rooted out?
Yeah. Well, part of it is Jews just don't have the good sense to act like a proper minority, because proper minorities are supposed to fail.
Right.
So that's always annoying. And I mean, and there's other complicated reasons as well that I outlined some of them in a blog. I mean, there is a propensity for Ashkenazi Jews in particular to do extraordinarily well in pursuits that require intellectual excellence.
I'm one of those.
And so that tends to place them in positions of, let's say, authority and competence at a rate that far exceeds their proportion in the population. You see the same thing happening to some degree in the United States now with Asians, with
very
Chinese
highly achieving
and Japanese and South Koreans, but also with people from India, because they're pulling above their weight, so to speak, demographically.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. You see that manifesting itself right now with the scandal that's surrounding Harvard, because it looks like if you were Asian, you had a 50% chance of getting into Harvard in comparison to other people with the same level of accomplishment as you. And so, the truth of the matter is that there are differences in people's ability, and some of those manifest themselves at the group level, and we don't know what to do about that.
Yeah,
so,
it's very taboo-like. If you look at some science, there are differences. For the Jewish people, it's easily to explain. We were prohibited to do a lot of things, so they had to excel at the things they could do. And that has developed in centuries, over the centuries. But
well, in the Asians in the U.S., they seem to do better primarily because of an enhanced work ethic. So I reviewed the literature on Asian accomplishment in junior high and high school.
So you're saying achieving is a cultural thing also?
Oh, definitely. What happens to Asian Americans is that the children of first generation Asian Americans overperform. And that starts to disappear by the second generation. And by the third generation, it's gone completely. So as the Asian American immigrant children, let's say, become more like Americans, the differential in their performance vanishes.
Okay, very interesting. Your book, 12 Rules for Life. You say you fight chaos. And this is like your handbook for fighting chaos.
Well, I provide an antidote rather than fighting it, let's say.
Okay.
Right. So, and I'm doing that by helping people try to find meaning, sort of sustaining meaning in their life. And a lot of that is a consequence of voluntarily accepting responsibility.
And it's about the individual. It's about individualism,
Yes. Well, it's about the individual. It's not exactly about individualism, because I believe that the proper category for a human being is the individual. Right. But it isn't exactly individualistic, because my sense is that if you conduct yourself properly, you take care of yourself, but also your future selves. And so that's a kind of community right away, because, for example, even though you're relatively young, you have to act in a way that hopefully allows you to set aside something useful for the old you. And so that means there's a community involvement element, even if you're only taking care of yourself properly. But although the focus of categorization should be the individual, if an individual is acting properly, they act in a manner that's of benefit to them, but also of benefit to their family, and also of benefit to their community.
Yes.
And so it's more like a relationship of harmony across levels of existence than something that's focused on like the happiness of the individual. I'm more interested in meaning and, well, as I said, meaning and responsibility. And there's definitely a communitarian element to that, even though I think the proper conceptual level fundamentally for people interacting with each other is individual to individual.
Right. Yeah.
It's partly because only individuals can feel pain. Right. So in some sense, the group is a fiction, because a group can't bear responsibility.
It's not one breathing organism.
No, it's not, and it's fluid across time, and it doesn't have a memory. It doesn't have a cohesive structure, and so it's heterogeneous. It's deeply heterogeneous in its structure.
And these groups make us very tribal. You've talked about this, right?
Yes.
You get tribal behavior, which means
it means violence.
Yeah, barbaric behavior.
Yeah, tribal. Anything that pushes us closer to the bounds of regression into tribalism, which is a very, very easy thing to precipitate, is very likely to increase the probability of intertribal violence.
Why are humans so receptive to group behavior? Why is that?
Well, we're unbelievably social.
Yeah.
We're unbelievably cooperative. And the flip side of that is that we cooperate within groups that we've managed to organize, but that tends to set us at odds with other groups.
Is it maybe a part of evolution that people are getting more individual, more developing yourself more instead of group behavior?
Well, we need other people because we're way more effective with them. With other people, you get division of labor and specialization, and then cooperation and trade, and that's unbelievably beneficial. And that makes us engage in reciprocal behavior, fair play, for lack of a better word. And so part of the reason that we're so group oriented is because it's so advantageous. Plus, we also have to raise families, and human infants are very dependent for a very long time. And so it actually takes a certain amount of collective effort to ensure that we can propagate. So there's all sorts of good things about our social capacity, but it has dangers. And the danger, one of the big dangers, is that we can devolve quite rapidly into a narrow tribalism. And the danger of that is, well, the increased probability of intergroup violence. And it's something we always have to be careful about, because it can happen very rapidly and can degenerate very rapidly. And treating each other as individuals is one of the ways that we forestall that proclivity, which is why I'm not happy about the identity politics types, because they keep insisting that tribal identity is of paramount importance. And that's a recipe for disaster as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and they dictate what you should think, how you should think, how you express yourself, how you address others, how you should address others, which is weird to me. I really like your this quote of yours, and it is, in order to think, you have to risk being offensive.
Yeah, well, you have to even risk offending yourself. I mean, imagine that you have a pet idea that you're emotionally attracted to, you know, but you're not sure it's a good idea, and so you have to think it through. Well, to do that, you have to set up opponents in fiction, in your imagination, and let those opponents hammer away at your pet idea. And if you think that isn't going to upset you, then you haven't experienced true thinking, because true thinking is a very emotionally upsetting experience. Just like true dialogue is emotionally upsetting if you're actually discussing a complex problem. Right. I mean, if the problem is complex, it's often the case that people, even who are positively predisposed to each other, have a hard time even laying out all the options on the table, even if they don't feel that they're necessarily going to implement them, because it's so upsetting to think of all the complex alternatives that might lay in front of you if you're faced with a complex problem. Or worse, that maybe you're conceiving the problem incorrectly. So thinking is by nature, especially when you're thinking about difficult problems, thinking is by nature something that is destabilizing in the short term, because it undermines certainty. Now, if your certainty is false, then you better undermine it, because if you act on a false certainty, then you're going to be in trouble. But that doesn't mean the process of thinking is anything but disruptive.
Thinking is actually questioning everything. Is that what you mean?
Well, it can be, but it's at least questioning some things, and it's at least questioning some things of desired value. Because if you're not questioning anything of desired value, then, well, you're not thinking about anything important. So thinking is offensive by its nature, at least in the short term. It's emotionally disruptive. And so you can't have, if you forbid dispute, competitive dispute, then all that's left for people is to nod and agree with each other, even if they're faced with a serious problem. And that's a very, very bad idea.
Well, you are being perceived as one of the bigger thinkers of our time. What drives you? Why? You say thinking is also very agonizing. It's
not as agonizing as not thinking. That's the only thing, is that but the time course is different. Thinking is agonizing in the short run, but really useful in the medium to long term. And I'm very aware of that. And so I'm willing to engage in conflictual thinking if I believe there's a true problem, because I'd rather see the problem solved so that peace and harmony can reign. And what drives me is a desire to fortify the individual against the dangers of totalitarian tribalism. That's what I've been trying to do in all my teaching and most of my academic work, not all of it, because I've researched a variety of different domains, but I've been trying to do that as an educator and as a clinician for 35 years. This is just an extension of that. I like to see people become more resilient and robust and courageous and noble and responsible and mature. And I think every time a single person manages that the world measurably tilts away from hell and towards heaven. So That's what motivates me. I mean, I've read the literature on the catastrophes of the 20th century very deeply and took it to heart. and certainly believed that part of the reason that, well, what happened to your family in World War II was that individual citizens didn't do their duty when they were called upon to, and they let the tyrannical identity politics, fascist types dominate, and then we got hell. And I don't want there to be more hell.
No.
So I'm hoping that individuals can clue in and wake up and adopt a proper mode of being, one that's associated with responsible citizenship, let's say, and that will fortify us against the recurrence of such catastrophes.
Yes. I saw you on a Norwegian talk show a couple of days ago, and you were talking about the equality between men and women, I think. They were looking at you with such confusion, and I know they looked very insecure about what you were saying, because it felt like they'd never heard before that women are actually biologically different than men, and it was very hard for them to swallow that information. And you said, look,
well, it's worse than that, actually. I was pointing out something that was even worse. It's a fatal flaw in the radical egalitarian's worldview. All of the evidence, okay, so imagine that you're looking for equality of outcome, okay, so that would be every occupational division was occupied by group members in precisely the same proportion as they exist in the general population.
Yeah.
So, okay, so first of all, that's impossible because there's so many different ways of slicing people into group identities, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. Not only do you want equality of representation at the outcome level, but you also want to ensure that everyone who's doing the same job, whatever that same means, is paid exactly the same amount of money, is given the same amount of value.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one set of desires.
That's real equality.
And on the other set of desires, you want everybody to have as much opportunity to make whatever choices they want to make freely without constraint.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't have both of those. Because what happens is that if you set up your society so that people's choice is maximized in the absence of societal pressure, let's say, which we could say has happened to some degree in countries like the Scandinavian countries and in the Netherlands, where some recent research has been conducted and published, then what happens is that you maximize certain differences of outcome instead of minimizing them.
Because of choice.
So you can't have equality of opportunity and equality of outcome at the same time. Well, and that's a catastrophe for the radical left because they want both.
Yeah.
So, and it's not technically possible.
Yeah.
So,
and it's very simple too. Like biologically, men are programmed differently than women. They like things. You said they literally like stuff, things. Women like people. You know, more interested.
On average, that's the case. I mean, there's a fair bit of overlap. It's not like there are no women that like things and no men that like people. There's a fair bit of overlap, but a lot of the occupational sorting happens at the extremes. So, for example, for engineers, that's a good example. If you're going to be an engineer, which is actually rather rare, you're going to be one of the people who is in the top 5 percentile of those who like things. And if you're going to be a nurse, you're going to be in the top 5 percentile of those who like people. And so almost all of those people are going to be male in the first case and female in the second case. Even though men and women are more the same than different, the differences are magnified at the extremes, and a lot of the selection takes place at the extremes.
Right.
And so, and good luck sorting that out. You know, and the Norwegian politician who was on with me, you know, she couldn't compute that because her fundamental presupposition was, well, if you just treat everybody the same to begin with, then the outcomes will be the same. It's like, nope, wrong. That's not what happens. The difference is actually maximized rather than minimizing.
Yeah.
And people say, well, that's pseudoscience, you know, and it's like, nope, it's not. Tens of thousands of subjects, multiple studies published in many, many journals.
Empirical.
And by the way, by social scientists who wouldn't have hoped that would be the outcome. So you can't even blame it on the bias of the scientists because it runs contrary to what they would have hoped for.
Right. I have a question for you. Do you believe in God?
Well, I have a good answer to that, and that is that I act as if I do. But I think that's also a very good definition of belief, because if you're trying to determine whether or not someone believes something, do you listen to what they say or do you watch what they do?
Right.
And I would say the more accurate measure is what they do.
So the values, the Christian values, is what matters, not if you believe or not.
Well, it's not so much whether you say that you believe, because that's a less valid marker. So, and you know, it's also in some sense like, I'm not exactly sure why that question makes me recoil. I think it's because it always seems to me to be a sort of trap, that question. I think it's partly because when I'm asked that, I'm usually asked by someone who wants to immediately put me into a box of their convenient choosing.
No, not me.
So, no, well, that could be, but
I'm really because you're a scientist, and it's like the devil's dilemma of scientists. You know, is there a God? Is there not a God? And if you're a scientist and you believe in God, how can you mix those two ideas? But I'm asking you. I come in peace, but I just wanted you to know to ask you, because I'm really curious. How do you feel as a scientist about?
Look, I think the idea that human beings are made in the image of God is an unbelievably powerful idea. I think it's a bedrock idea. It's maybe the bedrock idea of our culture.
Right.
I believe that part of the reason that we're made in the image of God, so to speak, so that language makes sense, is because part of what we do as conscious beings is participate in the process of generating reality from potential. So I believe that's an echo of the process that was outlined in the early openings, chapters, verses of Genesis, because that's essentially what's accounted. And I believe if there's anything divine at all, I would say the consciousness and self-consciousness of each individual human being is something divine. And I believe also that that's associated with what is of the highest value in being itself. And that's all essentially a religious viewpoint.
Yeah.
And it's conceivable to me that consciousness itself is reflective of something fundamentally divine about the nature of reality itself. It looks to me like that's the most appropriate conceptual scheme.
I think people are capable of doing divine things. Maybe you yourself, you actually you're very idealistic about your visions and ideas, but to me it's very simple.
Well, people are certainly capable of great evil, so we should be able to assume that they're also capable of the opposite.
Great goodness, yeah. I think it's like, to me, I vision God, or the idea of God, as people giving each other energy. If I give you negative energy, it will immediately affect you. It will affect the rest of your day, maybe your wife or daughter. If I give you positive energy, it will also influence you. So that's a godlike thing you can actually participate in, and being very aware of doing that. But
yes, well, I mean, part of what you want to do is decide whether you're trying to make things worse or better.
Right.
And if you make them worse, you can make them worse at all sorts of levels, including the apparently trivial levels that you just described, your day-to-day interactions with people. But they aren't trivial. And you do tilt things up or down with each choice that you make. And so I also believe that the best way to conceptualize human existence is as engagement in the struggle, the eternal struggle, let's say, between good and evil, which is also fundamentally a religious conception.
Yeah.
So,
do you believe in evil?
Oh, definitely. I can't. I think that anyone who's taken the time to educate themselves about the horrors of the 20th century, to say nothing of the horrors of human history overall, you can't walk away from that without believing in the reality of evil. There's just not. I can't see how that's possible. Not the least.
What moves you today? What can make you?
Well, what moves me on a regular basis at the moment is this lecture series that I'm doing. I'm touring around the world, and I'm talking to thousands of people about every second day. And the events are unbelievably positive, and all the people that are coming are there because they're trying to develop a vision for their life and to be more responsible and to tell the truth and to put their lives together and to take more responsibility for their family and their community. And then hundreds of them at these events tell me how their life was a while back. Usually there was some problem of some sort with their family or with their ambitions or with their mental health. And then they tell me what they've been doing to improve things and that it's going way better and that they're thrilled to death and that everything's going and that everything is proceeding in a much more positive manner. And so that's, God, you can't get enough of that. That's just, and every time I hear someone say that, I think, excellent. That's one more person who's working to keep things away from degenerating into hell. And so that's another victory as far as I'm concerned. And not a trivial one either. Because I do believe that each individual is the center of the world in some sense. And every time you have the privilege and good fortune to tap that center of existence into some form of more harmonious being, that's a major victory, a real victory, and a step forward in the eternal battle of good against evil. And that's probably a good place to stop.
Yes, it was. It was the best end quote. And I've taken way too much of your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson.
Very good talking with you.
Again, a big honor. And if you come back to Holland, I would like to invite you into the studio so we can actually look each other in the eye and have a beer or something.
Well, I appreciate the invitation and also the opportunity to talk to you.
Lots of success with your endeavors, and I hope to talk to you very soon again. Thank you, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you very much.